right, Justin, we're back for another episode here of AWM Insights. And I think we got a good one. We're going to go back to the basics a bit today, talk a little bit about portfolio construction. But I think the most fun, we should add this rolling when we were sitting here chatting, preparing for this, because it brought back a flood of memories of when I first got in the industry. And so probably some funny anecdotes to come. But we got this question from a client via one of our advisors, just talking about, how do we actually come up with asset allocation? And so, let's jump in. Let's just talk at a high level, how we think about that, how we arrive at a portfolio. And then we'll try not get too far into the weeds today, but I think there'll definitely be some follow-up that we can get into the nitty-gritty. But if somebody was to ask you this question that our client's asking, how do you actually come up with our asset allocation? Meaning, how is my money actually invested at a high level? Where would you start?
Sure. So point number one would be everything is custom. We've talked about that a lot on this podcast, but I don't want to forget about that in this conversation. It's really, really important. There's no one portfolio, one size fits all, cookie cutter type approach. We take a client's unique circumstances, have those deep conversations, and think about this as a constant moving target, right? It's not set in stone, but essentially try and isolate and figure out what's important to a client. That can be things that are both quantitative or qualitative. The quantitative things really do ideally go into a portfolio construction methodology. And where that starts, or where that's first initially represented, is on the fixed income side of the portfolio or the bond side of the portfolio. We're trying to cover those priorities, those shorter term priorities that are really, really important to a client's life. We don't want to take risk. We want to protect those. Those are the terms we use quite often. And so we start with that as the foundation, the foundational building block. You can really think about this almost as a construction project, where that is the basis of success, in our opinion, of really putting together something that has staying power and that eventually gives us high likelihood or high confidence in long-term success. So it really is that fixed income piece. And we're not getting overly creative and taking a lot of risk on the fixed income side of the portfolio or the bond side of the portfolio. We are holding high quality, very stable assets to match your priorities. And then we'll match those priorities with bonds that mature at a very similar point in time. So if you need liquidity a year from now, you're going to hold bonds that are going to roughly mature in that same amount of time. You're going to clip coupons or earn a little bit of yield along the way. But we're not getting overly creative. So that's the starting point that I would hit on first.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. The clients listening, right? Most of them are pretty familiar with the customization process. If you just think about your sport, a lot of athletes listening is, if I'm going to go about something, right, I'm going to perform at a high level. If I'm a lineman, I'm not going to look over at what the wide receivers are doing, and I'm going to implement the same drills as those guys,
exactly.
Right? You're both high performing elite athletes at the very highest level, but it would be silly to put you guys through the same drills, right? And so what we're ultimately trying to do is say, hey, if you're the lineman, let's build the portfolio for the lineman. If you're the wide receiver, let's build the portfolio for the right wide receiver. And unfortunately, it doesn't work that way in our industry. Oftentimes, it's more that cookie cutter approach. You'll hear people, we've talked about this. Hey, you're young, you're making a lot of money, and you're single, or maybe you're married, you have no kids. Oh, we got a long ways to go. You kind of understand the markets, right? We'll talk about the basics. So you're a moderate investor. We'll put 60% in stocks, or you actually really get the market. So we'll go 70% stocks, and then we'll put 40% or 30% into fixed income. And I think that's the message we're trying to tell you guys, is that's just adequate way, right? We want to customize that. So that's great. So we get to that high level. We figure out for everybody, exactly how much of a split we should have there. So once we take care of that bond piece, because that bond piece is your protective piece, right? That's what's going to provide for you in the short term. If you do a good job and you save your money, you have the ability, right, to then take some of those assets and put them in, people would say more risky. We would actually say higher expected return type area. And that manifests itself usually in ownership or equity, right? With stocks, or, maybe we'll get into the private side.
And the one nuance too I'd add, if you're an individual or a family that's no longer working, your fixed income portfolio might be a lot longer term oriented, right? If you don't have income coming in from other sources, guess what? Your passive income comes from your portfolio, and you need to adjust your fixed income or the bond allocation accordingly. So again, it's custom. It's depending on who you are. But to your point,
real quick, I do want to hit on passive income, because there was just, I can't let
put that in there.
go. But the most passive income out there, right, is generated from the most passive activity, which is investing in the public markets, whether it's bonds
all
or
you have to do is hit a button on the
I think
computer.
Everybody's brain goes to real estate.
Yeah.
And, anybody that is a real estate investor, a true real estate investor, will probably tell you it's not all that passive, right? There's an engagement there. So really good investment, but let's just not let that pass. This is the most passive way to invest, and it's a great way to invest. So anyways, back to you.
I love it. I mean, and we're being a little tongue in cheek here, but there's good reason. And what we're hoping to accomplish with this podcast is kind of cut through that noise, help you guys, all clients, listeners, discern entertainment from advice, and that what the data actually supports, as opposed to what these talking heads or what ads on internet websites or whatnot actually show us. But back to the topic at hand. So once you have that solid foundation, the fixed income bond piece of your portfolio really dialed in, and again, it's not set in stone, priorities change, life changes, and you can adjust. There's flexibility built in, but then we can go towards assets that have higher expected return over longer periods of time. So you hit on correctly, it is a higher expected return. This is typically company ownership, whether it's public or private, but there's also a longer time frame. It's a pretty key component to that. And then we say, okay, well, of that bucket that's custom to each and every client, how do we divide that between public markets and private markets? In the public markets, how do we divide that between US stocks, international developed stocks, think companies in Europe or Japan or Australia, and then emerging markets, think some South American companies? You need to actually take a quick step back and ask yourself, do we believe in this concept of diversification? We 110% do. That is what the data supports. You can get plenty of noise out there, whether it be from Cramer on NBC or just random ads trying to get you to click on it, those clickbait ads that are there to do exactly that, get you to click on it and not necessarily provide any substance behind it. So I want to make sure we start the conversation with the belief in diversification. So when we start there, we say, okay, let's go to the public markets first. Well, a perfect starting point is the global market capitalization. And all that is saying, what's the total dollar of publicly traded stocks out there across all countries? And how does that break down from a percentage basis? The US is somewhere around 60%, and it changes every day. But just to throw out some numbers for sake of conversation, the rest of the world is the remaining 40%. And emerging markets is probably around 10% of that. And then international developed, again, think European countries and companies, make up the difference. So that's a good proxy for what global investors think of from an investing standpoint. They're voting with actual dollars, and that's a great place to point. Why should we have any different knowledge or information from that aggregate investor base making a judgment call? That's the starting point. And then we start to, like I said, ask ourselves those questions. Does it make sense to deviate from that? And the short answer, and I'll pause here that for further kind of clarification, the short answer is we do think it makes sense to deviate, but there's logic behind it. Sure.
No, I think that's a good point. And, with the public markets, just to kind of frame with everybody or make sure everybody understands what we're talking about is, those publicly traded stocks, those publicly traded ownership in companies that anybody can go buy, right? You could, as long as you have an internet connection, you can open up a TD Ameritrade or a Schwab account and you can go buy stocks. And so that's where information is readily available to everybody. And the diversification call is just, but it's just smart at the end of the day, right? And I laugh at the Cramer example because when I first got in the industry, and this is what we were laughing about before we started, the broker that Eric and I first went to go work with at Morgan Stanley, one of his first pieces of advice as we were studying for all licensing exams is start watching Jim Cramer every single day. And I laugh because it's the most asinine thing I've ever heard now. Like it's true broker, big wirehouse kind of advice.
Plenty of good sound bites there.
Yeah, because we're reading, and this is the stat. So Jim Cramer, between 2017 and 2021, he made recommendations, 12,564 individual recommendations on stocks. What's absolutely hilarious about this is that the analysis of those stock recommendations showed that he actually underperformed the S&P 500 by 6 percentage points. That might not sound like a lot, but anybody that's paid a 5% agent fee or whatnot, you actually know when that converts to dollars, it is massive.
That's substantial.
It is absolutely massive. So, and look, there probably is somebody out there that can make stock picks and all that kind of stuff. I'm sure there is, but for people that spend time in this industry, I've yet to see it. We've both been in the industry a long time. We've talked to a lot of people. It's just not successful. And so I think going back to this entertainment versus investing, you want at the end of the day, right? Investing, you want to be boring. Yep. Especially on the 100%. Public side.
Right.
You want the highest level of certainty around achieving the outcomes that you set out to achieve. And if you start messing around with all this stuff, it just ends up putting you in a position where now you're trying to make calls to make things happen and you're exposing yourself to too much downside. So yeah, diversification at the high level, I think that's great. And, I know we don't want to go too far into the weeds today. We will in future episodes, because even when we get to, maybe you can tease it out and we'll wrap it up. But okay, great, Justin, we get to this point. We know we want to put, 79.2% into growth, higher expected return assets. Okay, great. We live in the US. You just talked about market cap. We're going to put 60% roughly of that money into the US, and we're going to put roughly 40% into international. That's great. But then how does it filter down? What companies do those go into?
Yeah. Well, diversification rings true on that answer as well. And that is not diversification in pure indexing. That's a great place to start. Again, we try and use what the logical approach starts with, right? Let's go to first principles. Indexes are great first principles. Index-based investing is a great first principle place to start. Low cost, diversification, all of that wonderful stuff. But then go to the data. Okay, the data actually shows us that there are parts of a broad market that outperform the index over time. So you kind of alluded to it. So value companies versus growth companies. These are cheaper. These are companies that trade at a cheaper valuation, hence the term value, and they typically outperform. I'm teasing it out there, but and I'll stop for future episodes. But that's the general sense.
And I think the good news about that, and we'll wrap up here, is you get to, well, you should, if you're doing it prudently, you get to perform, or why our clients get to have that allocation of this higher expected return is because we customize things, right? If you wouldn't probably want to go down this rabbit hole if you were just taking a cookie cutter approach. I would argue that you're probably putting yourself, potentially in a position that you wouldn't want to be in, because we are talking about time, right? And you've alluded to that. So we'll get into this whole why we pick small, why we pick value, why we pick profitable companies to be invested into when we start to look at the ownership side in a future episode. But hopefully this was helpful today. We'd love to hear your follow-up questions. We can weave those into the future episode. A reminder, you can do that via text by shooting a text to 602-704-5574. Comes directly to me and we'll address it on a future episode. And until next time, own your wealth, make an impact, and always be a pro.
The information in this podcast is educational and general in nature, and does not take into consideration the listener's personal circumstances. Therefore, it is not intended to be a substitute for specific, individualized financial, legal, or tax advice. To determine which strategies or investments may be suitable for you, consult the appropriate qualified professional prior to making a final decision.